$5,299 for a cruiser, but what's the catch? Today we're testing the CFMOTO CLC 450, so make sure you stay tuned. Welcome here in Switzerland. We're here in beautiful Zurich and we've got a very special assignment today. Finally, we get to test a cruiser, a bobber, and I'm always genuinely excited whenever we get bikes like this because I feel they don't get quite enough attention in the motorcycle world. And today we're taking a closer look at one very specific cruiser that comes with quite a few surprises. So stay tuned, we're putting the CFMOTO 450 CLC under the microscope. It's an A2 compatible bobber, which already makes it a very interesting motorcycle. We're going to test the bike in 4 different categories. First, we'll look at the first few meters and focus on handling, accessibility, and a few other points. After that, we'll talk about the heart and pulse of the motorcycle, the engine, which almost has a V-twin character. Then, of course, we'll get into the corners. Is it agile? What is this thing actually like to ride on twisty roads? And finally, we look at the numbers, build quality, and what you actually get for your money with this bobber, this cruiser. I think accessibility and general confidence are particularly important in this segment, especially for beginners. So that's the first thing we're looking at before we even start the motorcycle and head out for a longer ride. And the first thing that immediately stands out is the extremely low seat height. We're talking about 690 millimeters, which is seriously low. For some context, the CFMOTO 450 CLC's direct competitors are the Honda CMX 500 Rebel and the Kawasaki Eliminator 500. At 690 millimeters, the CFMOTO sits right at the lower end of that group and is basically on par with the Honda. Let me sit on it. And this is basically every beginner rider's dream. I'm 1.80 meters tall and I can sit extremely comfortably on the bike. The seat is small and almost feels like a tribute to those old school solo seats you used to see on classic bobbers. But it's comfortable, it works well, and it's very narrow. That means I can get my feet onto the ground incredibly easily, and I have a secure stance pretty much everywhere. That's very, very useful if you're a beginner. Of course, you also have to think about managing the weight. The bike weighs 183 kilograms. That isn't super light, but with cruisers and bobbers, the weight usually sits very low. You can see the engine down here, and the whole center of gravity is positioned low in the bike. And because the center of gravity is so low, the motorcycle is also very easy to maneuver. And speaking of maneuvering, there's something else that's really cool. Normally, cruisers and bobbers aren't exactly known for everyday practicality. And they're definitely not famous for having a huge steering angle. But this motorcycle, even though it has the look and feel of a cruiser, is a bit of a wolf in sheep's clothing, or maybe I should say it's slightly disguised. Because in terms of steering angle, it actually feels much more like a naked bike. We rode up and down this beautiful corner several times for the camera shots, and I could basically turn around and change direction without having to shuffle the bike back and forth. There's one more thing I want to show you very briefly. The motorcycle had previously been with a beginner rider for testing, and she dropped it. That's something that can simply happen when you're starting out. And because of that, we can now see quite clearly where the bike actually takes damage. At the back, the exhaust has taken a hit. Moving forward, you can see that the brake lever has been bent in slightly. The mirror has also taken a knock, and down below, the gear lever has some damage. But overall, the damage is really very minor. And that's important too, because whether you're a beginner or not, things happen when riding motorcycles. Maybe the ground is wet, maybe there's a leaf, maybe something unexpected happens, and the bike ends up on its side. So I think it's cool to see that, especially from an accessibility and beginner perspective, you don't destroy the entire motorcycle just because it tips over. Now let's move on to the sound. The second category, or the second major topic, is the engine and the sound. And sound is particularly important on a cruiser like the CLC 450. There's something familiar about this motorcycle, the engine. We already know this engine from the 450 NK and the 450 MT. It's a 449 cubic centimeter engine. It produces 44 horsepower and 42 Newton meters of torque at 6,250 revolutions per minute. Of course, the engine has been adapted slightly for this model. It delivers a bit more torque lower down, and then there's the old trick we're starting to know quite well, the 270-degree crankshaft. That gives the engine a sound that's very similar to a V-twin. And I have to say, I was genuinely surprised when this thing fired up. Let me show you. That's the standard exhaust. And it sounds genuinely deep and gritty. It almost sounds like a much bigger motorcycle. I find that fascinating. I think they've done a really good job with it. The engine also has a very particular character that you might not normally associate with a bobber. And I think that's interesting. Again, it actually feels quite close to a naked bike. Of course, as I said, you've got a bit more torque lower down, which means you can cruise through corners in a relaxed way while still carrying a decent amount of speed. But the engine also likes to rev. Having said that, between around 3,000 and 6,000 revolutions per minute is definitely the sweet spot. That's where it feels best. But for a 450, what I find really interesting is that there's basically no obvious hole in the power delivery. The engine pulls nicely and smoothly throughout almost the entire rev range. On a bobber or a cruiser, it isn't about how quickly you get to 100 kilometers per hour. It's about how big the grin is on your face when you roll into an 80 kilometers per hour zone. It's genuinely fun to ride. The engine is also perfectly capable on the motorway. 120 kilometers per hour is absolutely no problem. Even at 80 kilometers per hour, I rarely found myself using sixth gear because the revs are already almost too low at that point. CFMOTO claims a top speed of 152 kilometers per hour. Obviously, we didn't test that here in Switzerland, but that's what the spec sheet says. And the locations here in Switzerland are always fantastic. Those of you who know the area, especially if you're from Switzerland, will probably recognize that we're on the Albis Pass. And back there is Lake Zurich. It's absolutely beautiful. And it also fits perfectly with what we're about to talk about. You're probably wondering why we've come somewhere with so many tight corners. Well, that's exactly what makes the CLC 450 so interesting. It doesn't just have bobber DNA. I genuinely had a lot of fun riding it through the corners. And I want to start with the most obvious thing, the wheels. We've got these very balloon-like 16-inch wheels. And I completely understand why some people might have doubts about whether wheels and tires like these are really going to work well in corners. But I actually thought they were very good. I really had no complaints about the tires. What I noticed is that the motorcycle turns into corners very eagerly. It's surprisingly agile and genuinely enjoys changing direction. Transitions from one side to the other are extremely easy. Again, that's probably partly because the center of gravity is so low. The wheelbase also isn't excessively long, so despite the cruiser styling, the bike manages to feel stable while still being agile. And that's a very good compromise. It's also a combination that inspires confidence very quickly. I felt comfortable on this motorcycle almost immediately. Of course, there's one thing you have to remember, and you can already see it just by looking at the bike. It sits very low, and as a result, the suspension travel isn't huge. At the rear, we have 96 millimeters of suspension travel. That results in 153 millimeters of ground clearance. And you do notice that fairly quickly, especially when I was riding through the city. You can definitely feel bumps and rougher surfaces more clearly. That's one disadvantage compared with other types of motorcycles. There simply isn't as much suspension travel here, so bumps aren't absorbed quite as smoothly. But something that is smooth is the way the bike leans into corners. And of course, those 153 millimeters of ground clearance also play a role because the available lean angle is limited. That's obvious. But in a way, that can actually be a good thing too, especially when I think about beginner riders. You get a very clear signal when you're starting to reach the limit of how far you can lean. Because at some point, you'll start hearing things scrape. And when that happens, you're still a long way away from the motorcycle suddenly falling over. And that scraping point comes surprisingly late. For a bobber or cruiser, you really can ride this thing quite sportily. So you can lean this bike over properly and you get a very clear signal or feedback when you're getting close to the limit because you start scraping something on the ground. The motorcycle has a really pleasant and refined running feel. That's important too. It's relaxing when you want to ride in a relaxed way. There is one exception. If you're riding at around 20 or 30 kilometers per hour in city traffic, the throttle response isn't quite as smooth. At those speeds, you can feel a bit of jerkiness, but once you're above 60 kilometers per hour, the motorcycle becomes extremely calm. And I started wondering why the whole bike feels so refined. Even acoustically, you don't really hear anything. There's no clattering, rattling, or mechanical noise. Then I walked around the motorcycle and realized, great, it has a belt drive, and that's something you basically don't get anywhere else in this class. Neither the Kawasaki nor the Honda has one. Of course, the belt drive is also low maintenance, which will come back into the equation when we talk about value for money. But another major advantage is that it's very quiet. And I really like that combination. You have this V-twin-like exhaust note, while the rest of the motorcycle is almost silent. You don't hear a chain rattling or any other mechanical noise. For me, that's a beautiful thing. They've done that very well. A quick word about the brakes. They work. They didn't massively surprise or impress me. I'd simply describe them as average. But they slow the bike down safely and predictably. You also get ABS and traction control, which is great in the 450 class. At the same time, motorcycle technology has progressed so much that you almost expect those features nowadays. I was also happy with the gearbox. Obviously, there's no quick shifter here. You still have to shift manually, which is probably something many new riders will be learning anyway. But the gearbox is very well set up. For me, there's really very little to criticize here. It's time to talk money. We already know how deep you have to reach into your pocket. The price is $5,299, but there are quite a few features included. So let me quickly walk around the bike and show you. Down here on the side, very cleverly integrated, you have both a USB-A and a USB-C port. I think that's fantastic. Because even though this is a cruiser, CFMOTO clearly understands that younger riders and the next generation want to be able to charge their phone, headphones, or communication system. Then over here, another nice detail is the ignition lock positioned at the side. And while we're here, I'll also talk a little about build quality because I've been impressed by it. You've got this beautifully machined component here. Maybe they've taken a little inspiration from other brands, but okay. Up front, you have the mudguard and it's actually made from metal. Everything feels solid, and it's nice to see that they're using materials other than just plastic. Then we move towards the rear. You've got these wheels, which I personally think look fantastic. The styling then continues across the tank, which also has really nice lines and curves. And here you've got a proper metal fuel cap, just like on genuinely classic motorcycles. Great. That's exactly what you want when you're riding a bobber. You want a bit of that heritage feeling. And even though CFMOTO is a relatively young brand in this segment, the bike still manages to create that heritage atmosphere. Another thing I think is excellent is the display. Pairing my phone with it this morning took about a minute. And you can mirror Google Maps onto the small display. It works really well. You do have to keep your phone active though. You can't lock it. If you lock the phone, you only get turn-by-turn directions with distances. There are two things I want to mention about the display. First, one criticism. At the moment, with this software version at least, the navigation distance can only be displayed in miles. The second thing I find a little strange is the standard display layout. Normally, it shows speed in an analog style format, while the engine revs are displayed digitally as a number. personally, I prefer it the other way around. I like having the exact speed displayed as a digital number because then I know immediately how fast I'm going, and I'd rather have the revs shown graphically or in an analog style display above it at C. There's also no option to choose a second display theme or layout. I think that's a real shame, and hopefully CFMOTO will fix it. Obviously that's a software issue, but it still makes the motorcycle feel slightly imperfect. And that's okay. Every motorcycle has its weaknesses or points you can criticize. At the rear, as I mentioned earlier, we have the belt drive. And when we're talking about running costs, that's a major benefit because it requires very little maintenance. It doesn't demand much from you. There's no chain to adjust. And as I said earlier, it's quiet too. So this is another feature that feels almost premium for this class of motorcycle. And now we come to what, for me, is the big headline feature. 5 years of warranty or 40,000 kilometers. That is a serious statement when you compare it with the warranty packages some other manufacturers offer to end customers. To me, that communicates confidence. Because if I buy this motorcycle and sell it after 2 years, I can tell the next owner, you still have 3 years of warranty left. Of course, that can also have a positive effect on resale value. And I know I've been giving the bike a lot of praise here, but ultimately, those are numbers that speak for themselves. As I've mentioned, there are also things that aren't perfect about the motorcycle. But especially if you're an A2 beginner, or maybe you're getting older and no longer want to ride big, heavy motorcycles, then this is a very strong candidate. I definitely recommend taking one for a test ride. I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope you enjoyed watching too. If you did, I'd really appreciate a like or a comment. Let me know what you think and we can discuss it down below. Other than that, there's only one thing left to say. Ride safe, as always. See you next time. Take care. Ciao.